Gaslighting is the art of breaking reality while pretending it's still whole. This invisible weapon has been perfected over centuries. From the confessional booth to the algorithm, the research shows that the better the gaslighter, the more invisible they become, leaving victims doubting their own memories. We'll trace how this psychological warfare tactic evolved into our digital age, where truth becomes fragile and manipulated by confident denial on social media platforms. The cathedral's shadow extends far beyond stone and glass. Within those towering walls, medieval builders created not just places of worship, but instruments of influence. The sense of awe one feels on entering a cathedral was not incidental. It was the result of carefully calculated design. The lofty ceilings, the filtered light, the vast spaces that dwarf the human form, all combine to evoke submission. This architecture did not simply inspire belief, it taught a lesson in hierarchy. When the divine felt unreachable, obedience to earthly authority seemed only natural. The Gothic cathedral was a stage where the relationship between power and faith was acted out. The church and the monarchy reinforced one another, mirroring the same structure of dominance. God and the king occupied the distant heights, while ordinary people stood below, reminded of their place. This was architecture as psychological conditioning. It spoke without sound, convincing through proportion and scale. Each curve and arch silently rehearsed the message: authority is immense, and you are small within it. This was an early form of environmental control, a physical manipulation of perception that shaped thought and behaviour. By mastering space, those in power mastered the mind. People entering these spaces learned deference before hearing a sermon or speaking a prayer. The grandeur was part of the ritual itself, embedding submission into daily experience. Belief became not just a matter of faith, but a practiced response to an overwhelming environment. The structure itself performed the gaslighter's trick, altering reality until acceptance felt like reverence. This principle persists in modern architecture. Step inside the headquarters of a major institution, a bank, a government building, a tech giant, and the same psychological cues reappear. The wide atriums, echoing hallways, and polished surfaces reinforce order and dominance. These spaces are designed to command quiet compliance. Their immensity assigns weight to the institution before reason or evidence is offered. You feel it first in the body, a low hum of insignificance that prepares the mind to submit. Architectural intimidation remains a subtle form of psychological warfare. It doesn't threaten overtly. It harmonizes authority with environment until the two seem inseparable. Through space, hierarchy becomes naturalized. The environment does the disciplining, leaving little room for conscious resistance. When power can shape how we feel before it even speaks, it no longer has to justify itself. That is the enduring shadow cast by the cathedral, a blueprint for influence that outlived its stone foundations. And once that blueprint was laid, there was still a problem power needed to solve: how to keep obedience intact when belief began to waver. The invention of the heretic was one of history's most effective psychological tools. When unity began to fracture, authority didn't seek to understand the doubts, it weaponized them. By naming certain ideas or individuals as dangerous, leaders found a way to redirect collective fear inward. The heretic became less a person and more a symbol, absorbing every quality the community feared or rejected in itself. Questioning faith transformed from a private thought into a public risk. The label created boundaries not through theology alone, but through fear of exclusion and moral contamination. The heretic's creation solved a political problem with emotional precision. Anyone who strayed from official teachings could instantly be repositioned as an outsider, untouchable and suspect. The community's anxiety found release in unified condemnation. Public trials were the theatre of this process. They turned suspicion into spectacle, crowded squares filled with neighbours watching someone become a warning. These performances didn't need truth to be effective, they relied on doubt. Once a person's guilt became a matter of show rather than evidence, fear did the rest. Fear doesn't need results, it only needs uncertainty to spread. This was social control, disguised as protection. Authorities defined a threat, then promised safety through obedience. The sequence repeated predictably: define the enemy, reward conformity, punish deviation. The rhythm itself became soothing in its simplicity. The populace learned that stability depended not on truth, but on shared hostility. Heresy trials were not simply about destroying dissent. They were about preserving the illusion that danger was external. In this way, fear became a unifying force that disguised deeper fractures in power and belief. What made this tactic even more effective was how it turned people against their own sense of agency. The heretic hunt blurred the line between vigilance and submission. Ordinary citizens began to believe that collecting names and rumours was a form of moral action. The process made people confuse gathering information with taking meaningful steps toward change. The act of policing others gave them a fragile sense of control, even as they surrendered real autonomy. Gradually, fear outsourced authority. Individuals internalized the gaze of the Inquisitor and carried it into their daily lives. The success of this mechanism lay in its invisibility. Once the crowd accepted the narrative, the heretic ceased to be a threat and became a mirror, reflecting everything the collective wished to deny about itself. Dissent grew quieter, self-editing became habitual, and silence became safety. Behind the spectacle, power had found its most efficient instrument: belief shaped by fear, maintained by those who feared most to lose it. But managing belief required more than public judgment. Power soon sought a system that could turn confession itself into proof, and from that need a new machinery emerged. The Inquisition's playbook began with procedure, but mastered perception. Behind its formality lay a precise system for manufacturing truth. Each interrogation was staged not merely to punish, but to reshape reality itself. The aim was psychological submission, to make the accused doubt their own thoughts until they aligned with the Inquisitor's version of the world. Gaslighting does not erase reality, it simply asks you to doubt it. The Inquisition perfected this logic centuries before the term existed, creating a machinery that could make even certainty feel like sin. Confession stood at the center of this mechanism. It was both the weapon and the reward. A forced confession did more than confirm guilt. It endorsed the power of the system itself. Once the accused admitted fault, the circle closed. The process proved its own righteousness. What makes this so effective is the inward turn of pressure. The accused stopped arguing with the Inquisitor and began arguing with themselves, trying to reconcile memory, fear, and faith. This internal battle made resistance unnecessary. The mind did the breaking on its own. The victim was guided to utter the words that validated their oppressor's truth, believing that compliance might rebuild what fear had already dissolved. Every step of the process was calculated and recorded. Secrecy clouded accusations, and procedures masked their manipulative core beneath the language of divine justice. The playbook described not only methods of interrogation, but the rhythms of fear: how to isolate, how to confuse, how to make silence feel like survival. These were techniques that used a victim's own mind against them, eroding trust in personal memory while elevating external authority. The Inquisitors claimed to access divine insight, framing their questions as revelations rather than tricks. Through repetition and suggestion, they guided the accused towards surrender until the distinction between voluntary confession and mental collapse disappeared. This method extended far beyond the interrogation chamber. Communities learned the lesson as much as the individuals did. Watch what you say, doubt what you think, and never trust your certainty more than sanction truth. The psychological infrastructure of the Inquisition relied on fear, but it sustained itself through imitation. Those who observed became self-policing agents, enforcing doctrine before punishment was necessary. Compliance grew automatic, undistinguished from belief. The system's power no longer required threat. It lived in the quiet discipline of minds already trained to obey. Yet even the most efficient fear-based control begins to erode over time. Anxiety exhausts loyalty, and terror eventually dulls its edge. To secure obedience that could endure beyond dread, authority needed something softer, a different kind of promise. And so a new lever appeared, offering not punishment but peace, to win devotion where fear alone could not. Salvation for a price began as the Church's most brilliant bargain, a structure that turned faith into transaction. It offered mercy with conditions and belonging with boundaries. Control shifted from punishing the wayward to managing the hopeful. Fear and reward became a seamless loop. Eternal damnation on one side, eternal peace on the other, both controlled by a single authority. The result was not just obedience, but emotional dependency. Within this system, choices weren't really choices. They were rehearsed affirmations of loyalty disguised as acts of free will. The medieval church perfected a balance between threat and promise. It wielded the horror of damnation as a deterrent while presenting salvation as the ultimate prize. Yet that salvation came at a cost: devotion, confession, compliance. The population was caught between two poles that defined existence itself. To question doctrine was to risk eternal loss. To conform was to secure infinite safety. This binary was elegant in its simplicity and unbreakable in its reach. It dissolved the distinction between faith and submission, turning theology into infrastructure. Over time, people ceased to imagine alternatives because the very concept of outside salvation had been erased. This was control through comfort. By claiming sole authority over the soul's destination, the Church made compliance feel like a choice and oppression feel like protection. People traded autonomy for reassurance, believing safety lay in surrendering judgment to the institution. The system rewarded that dependence. Each act of obedience reaffirmed the Church's promise of peace, and each gesture of doubt confirmed the need for authority to guide the weak. Once internalized, this pattern required no enforcement. The desire for salvation became self-regulating. The faithful policed their own thoughts, mistaking submission for virtue and security for grace. The same exchange reappears in modern forms of authority. Today, salvation is sold not in prayers, but in permissions, access, convenience, connection. The price is no longer tithes or penance, but privacy and autonomy. We hand over personal data in exchange for the illusion of safety, protection from chaos, obscurity, or isolation. Like the believer bound to a confessor, the modern user is tethered to a system that promises meaning and comfort, but only within its borders. The dependency that follows feels voluntary, yet it locks us in place. We grow convinced our well-being depends on the system's favour, that opting out is unthinkable. When power makes compliance feel natural, it no longer needs force. The trade-off becomes invisible, almost instinctive. Every exchange, obedience for salvation, data for convenience, reinforces the same architecture of control. And behind each promise of peace lies a ledger, keeping precise account of what has been surrendered and gained,